As the plane doors closed and the cabin settled into silence, no one expected the quiet man in the window seat to become the center of a fiery confrontation. But when a rude passenger challenged Mel Gibson's faith, the entire flight would witness a moment they'd never forget. The hum of the airport at midnight had a rhythm of its own, a mixture of weary travelers and soft overhead announcements. Mel Gibson moved through the crowd quietly, wearing a weathered jacket and a baseball cap pulled low. Most people wouldn't have recognized him at a glance, but for the observant ones, the unmistakable features peeked out just enough to spark hushed whispers and discreet nudges. He wasn't here to make a scene. A quiet flight, a good book, and a chance to collect his thoughts were all he wanted tonight. The flight attendants greeted him politely as he boarded, their expressions betraying a flicker of recognition. Mel nodded, offering a faint smile, and slid into his window seat near the middle of the plane. Around him, passengers stole glances, some more subtle than others. A couple of phones were already angled discreetly, their owners pretending to scroll as they snapped blurred photos. Mel adjusted his seatbelt and gazed out the window, tuning it all out. Beside him, a man in his late 40s slumped into the aisle seat, dropping his carry-on into the footwell with a thud. He wore an air of irritation, like a second skin. "Another long flight," he muttered, half to himself, half to anyone within earshot. Mel didn't respond, content to let the man's grumbling float past him. The man, however, wasn't the type to let silence linger. He glanced over, his eyes narrowing slightly as he took in Mel's face. A spark of recognition flickered there, but instead of excitement, it seemed to stoke something else. Curiosity, maybe even skepticism. "You're him, aren't you?" the man asked, his voice carrying a hint of accusation. Mel turned to him, offering a polite smile. "Depends on who you think him is," he replied, his tone even. The man chuckled, though it wasn't friendly. "Yeah, thought so. Mel Gibson, right? Braveheart? That guy." Mel inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the obvious, without indulging the tone. The man leaned back, crossing his arms. "Didn't expect to be sitting next to a Hollywood guy tonight," he said. "Not that I keep up with your stuff. Got tired of all that fake celebrity crap years ago." Mel turned his attention back to the window, hoping the conversation would end there. It didn't. The man's gaze lingered, and his eyes caught the faint glint of a small cross necklace hanging just below Mel's collar. His lip curled, almost imperceptibly. "That's rich," he said, his voice laced with sarcasm. "A guy like you wearing that. You believe in all that, huh? God, faith, the whole deal?" Mel didn't respond immediately, sensing the hostility under the man's words. Finally, he answered calmly, "I do." The man laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound that drew the attention of a few nearby passengers. "Figures," he said. "You know, I've always thought religion's just a crutch. Something people cling to when they can't face reality." He shook his head, smirking. "But to each their own, right?" Mel looked at him, his expression unreadable. "Right," he said softly. The plane hummed with the familiar rhythm of ascent, engines roaring softly as it climbed into the night sky. Mel Gibson leaned back into his seat, exhaling slowly, but the tense energy from the man beside him was impossible to ignore. The passenger, now emboldened by the hum of anonymity in the air, leaned closer, his voice louder than before, almost as though daring the rest of the cabin to hear. "So, you really buy into all that, huh? Faith, forgiveness, redemption? Seems a little rich coming from someone who's had their fair share of, let's just say, public mistakes." Mel turned his head slightly, meeting the man's gaze. His eyes, calm but firm, betrayed no irritation. "Everyone's made mistakes," he replied. "It's what we do after them that counts." The man scoffed, shaking his head in exaggerated disbelief. "Come on, man. You're not seriously sitting here acting like you're some beacon of morality. We've all seen the headlines, right? The outbursts, the controversy, and now you're just what? Hiding behind some big faith story? That's how you sleep at night." His tone was biting, designed to wound, and for the first time, Mel felt the weight of eyes on him from across the cabin. Passengers were beginning to notice. Whispers floated through the air like echoes in a canyon, soft but persistent. Mel's response was measured. "I'm not hiding behind anything," he said. "I've made my mistakes, sure. But if you're looking for perfection, you won't find it in me or anyone else." The man's laughter was sharp and unkind. "That's convenient," he said. "Blame it on being human, right? But let's be honest. Faith is just an excuse people use when they can't handle reality. It's for the weak, the ones who can't face the truth about how messed up the world really is." The cabin seemed to hold its breath at the man's words. A woman a few rows back shifted in her seat, leaning slightly forward as if to say something, but stopped herself. A middle-aged man across the aisle frowned, shaking his head subtly. Yet no one intervened. The tension hung heavy in the air, every whispered word or stifled cough amplifying the silence between Mel and his neighbor. Mel's fingers rested lightly on the armrest, his thumb tracing an invisible line. His face remained impassive, but his eyes seemed to cloud for a moment, as if reliving something distant yet deeply personal. The echoes of past controversies, the media frenzy, and the fallout from his own mistakes rushed to the forefront of his mind. The headlines, the judgment, the moments he'd barely survived, all of it was there. He closed his eyes briefly, then opened them with renewed clarity. "Maybe faith is for the weak," Mel said finally, his voice steady, cutting through the tension like a knife. "But maybe that's the point. It takes strength to admit you're not strong enough on your own." His words landed with a weight that made the man falter, just for a moment. The cabin was silent, every passenger waiting for what would come next. The plane leveled off, and the cabin lights dimmed, casting a softer glow over the tense atmosphere. Mel remained seated upright, his shoulders relaxed, but his mind alert. The passenger beside him leaned closer, emboldened by his earlier tirade, his voice dripping with skepticism. "So you think your faith gives you answers? That it's some magical solution to all the crap you've been through?" His words carried the kind of sharpness that came from a deep-seated bitterness, one that sought validation in tearing others down. Mel exhaled slowly, his gaze steady but thoughtful. "No, it doesn't give me all the answers," he began, his voice calm but deliberate. "But it's given me perspective when I didn't think I could keep going. There was a time in my life when everything felt like it was crumbling. My career, my family, my sanity, it was all slipping away. And in the darkest moments, when I thought there was no way out, faith wasn't a crutch. It was the only light I had." The passenger smirked, though something in his eyes flickered, an unease he couldn't quite mask. "Sounds like a nice story," he said, his tone dismissive. "But people like, you don't know what real struggle is. You've got money, fame, you can mess up, and the world still hands you a golden ticket. What do you even know about losing everything?" Mel's lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment, he hesitated, weighing how much to say. Then he spoke, his voice quieter, but no less resolute. "I know what it's like to lose everything that matters. There was a time when I'd alienated the people I loved most, burned bridges I thought were unbreakable. I looked in the mirror one day and didn't even recognize myself. The world called me many things during that time, and the truth is, most of it wasn't far off. But I also know what it feels like to pick up the pieces one painful step at a time and find redemption, not because I deserved it, but because grace doesn't work like that." His words hung in the air, resonating with a raw vulnerability that silenced the murmurs around them. The passenger's smirk faltered, his arms crossing defensively as he shifted in his seat. "Grace," he repeated mockingly. "What, like some kind of invisible forgiveness just fixes everything? That's just an easy way out. Life doesn't work like that." Mel turned slightly, his gaze sweeping across the cabin. He could see the eyes of other passengers fixed on him, a mix of curiosity and quiet encouragement. This wasn't just between him and the man anymore. It had become something larger, and he knew he couldn't let it fester. He leaned forward slightly, his tone firm but unthreatening. "You're right about one thing. Life doesn't work like that. It's not easy. But grace isn't about erasing the past. It's about facing it head-on and deciding to be better, even when it feels impossible." The passenger shook his head, his frustration mounting. "And what makes you so special, huh? Why does your faith even matter?" His voice carried a challenge, one that felt final, daring Mel to respond. The cabin seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would come next. Mel sat back slightly, his face calm but his eyes burning with an unmistakable resolve. He wasn't speaking just for the man beside him anymore. He was speaking for the room, for himself, for every moment in his life when silence wasn't enough. He tilted his head, his voice low and steady, yet somehow it carried across the cabin. "You asked why my faith matters. I'll tell you." He paused, the weight of his words building before he continued. "There was a night years ago when I hit rock bottom. Not just career-wise, not just in the public eye. Those were the surface-level problems. Inside I was done. Everything I cared about was slipping through my fingers, and I had no one to blame but myself. The people I loved were hurt, disappointed. The world wasn't just watching me fail, they were cheering for it. And honestly, I didn't blame them." The cabin was silent now, the faint hum of the engines, the only background sound as every passenger leaned in, caught in the web of his words. Mel's gaze dropped to his hands, as though the memory still weighed on them. "I remember sitting alone, surrounded by everything I thought I wanted. Money, fame, all the stuff people think makes life easier. And it felt empty, worse than empty. I felt like a ghost, walking through a life that didn't belong to me anymore." He took a breath, his voice tightening with emotion. "And then there was this moment. I can't even explain it. I was alone, spiraling, and I just broke. I fell to my knees and said, 'If there's anything out there, anything at all, help me.' I wasn't expecting an answer. Honestly, I didn't think I deserved one. But in that moment, it wasn't about deserving. It was about surrender. For the first time in my life, I stopped trying to control everything." The man beside him shifted uncomfortably, his arms crossed as though shielding himself from the weight of the words. Around them, passengers were no longer pretending to read or listen to music. Faces turned, eyes softened, and the faintest trace of empathy began to ripple through the room. Mel's tone softened, but his conviction never wavered. That moment didn't fix everything overnight. It didn't undo the damage or erase the pain I caused. But it gave me the strength to start again, one day at a time. And that's what faith has been for me. Not an escape, not a crutch. Just the courage to keep going when I had nothing else. The man let out a forced laugh, though it lacked its earlier sharpness. "Sounds convenient," he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. "I mean, come on. You're telling me some big cosmic force just handed you a second chance." Mel turned to him fully now, his expression unyielding. "No one handed me anything. I had to fight for it every day. But it's not about getting a second chance. It's about believing one is possible." The man fell silent, his cynicism faltering under the weight of the truth hanging in the air. The other passengers, once spectators, were now witnesses to something far greater than a simple argument. The passenger leaned back, a smirk tugging at his lips as he saw his chance to regain control. "You know," he began, his voice sharper now, laced with a cruelty he didn't bother to mask. "It's funny to hear you talk about redemption like you're some kind of saint. Last I checked, the world remembers a different story. The tirades, the headlines, all that righteous anger of yours. What was it you said back then? Or maybe we shouldn't repeat it here, huh?" Mel's face didn't flinch, but a subtle shadow passed over his features. His hands rested loosely on his lap, but there was tension in his shoulders now, a quiet restraint that only the observant would notice. The cabin felt colder, the hum of the engines unable to drown out the icy tone of the man's words. He wasn't done. He was just warming up. You want to talk about struggle? The man pressed on, his words deliberately slow, calculated to strike. You're a guy who had everything, and you threw it away. People trusted you, looked up to you, and you broke that trust. And now you sit here like some reborn prophet, acting like the past doesn't matter. Because what? You found God. There was an audible shift in the cabin, a collective unease as the passengers watched the scene unfold. A woman in the row across visibly winced, glancing at Mel with quiet sympathy. A young man further up the aisle muttered something under his breath, but no one spoke loud enough to break the tension. Mel's silence stretched longer than anyone expected, and for a moment, it seemed like he wouldn't respond. But the passenger wasn't finished. He leaned closer, his voice dropping just enough to sound venomous. Let's be real. You talk about faith and grace, but isn't that just a way to excuse yourself? You get to mess up as much as you want, hurt whoever you want, and then hide behind some big invisible guy upstairs. That's how people like you get away with it. The words landed like a punch, and a collective gasp rippled through the cabin. Mel's jaw tightened slightly, his eyes flickering with something unspoken. For a fleeting second, his composure seemed to crack, the weight of the accusation settling on him. The passenger saw it, mistaking it for victory, and leaned back with a satisfied grin. For a long, heavy moment, Mel didn't say a word. He didn't meet the passenger's eyes or glance around the cabin. Instead, he leaned forward, his elbows resting lightly on his knees. And when he spoke, his voice was low, deliberate, and razor-sharp. You think grace is about avoiding accountability? His eyes finally locked onto the man's, unwavering. Grace isn't an excuse. It's the strength to face everything you've done and still believe you can be better. The cabin was silent. The words hung there, suspended in the air like the moment before a storm breaks, leaving everyone waiting to see what would come next. Mel sat upright, his gaze steady and unwavering. The passenger's smug expression faltered as Mel's voice cut through the tense silence, steady but with an undeniable weight. You don't have to believe me. You don't even have to respect me. But don't mistake my faith for weakness, and don't think for a second it's about avoiding consequences. Faith isn't a shield. It's a mirror. And trust me, I've had to look into that mirror more times than I can count. And what I saw wasn't pretty. The cabin was utterly still, the quiet punctuated only by the soft hum of the engines. Mel leaned forward slightly, his tone growing more passionate, yet never losing its measured control. I know what the world thinks of me. I know what you think of me. And you're not wrong. I've made mistakes that I'll carry for the rest of my life. But you know what grace does? It doesn't erase the past. It redeems it. It takes the broken, the messy, the painful, and it shows you that you're more than the sum of your worst moments. He paused, letting his words sink in. Passengers exchanged glances, their expressions shifting from curiosity to something deeper. Some nodded subtly. Others leaned forward, caught in the magnetic pull of his voice. Even those who had been scrolling through their phones had stopped, their attention fully on him. Scripture says, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." Mel continued, his voice steady, but filled with emotion. Do you know what that means? It means that the places where we're weakest, where we've failed the most, are the very places where redemption begins. I don't deserve the second chances I've been given, but that's not what grace is about. It's about being shown mercy when you don't deserve it, and then using that mercy to do better. The passenger beside him shifted uncomfortably, his earlier confidence fading under the weight of Mel's words. His smirk was gone, replaced by a forced neutrality that betrayed his discomfort. He opened his mouth as if to interject, but nothing came out. Mel's voice continued, softer now, but no less powerful. I don't share this because I want your approval or your understanding, Mel said, glancing around the cabin, his eyes meeting those of the passengers who watched him with rapt attention. I share it because I've seen what happens when you let shame and guilt define you. They eat you alive. But I've also seen what happens when you let hope in even just a little. It changes everything. A faint sniffle came from a woman a few rows back, her eyes glistening as she dabbed at them with a tissue. Others nodded silently, their faces softened with empathy. Mel finally turned back to the man beside him, his gaze steady, but without malice. "You asked me why my faith matters? It matters because it's the only reason I'm still standing here today." The cabin erupted into applause, a spontaneous, heartfelt gesture that shattered the tension and filled the space with warmth. The passenger sat frozen, his arrogance crumbling in the face of Mel's authenticity, while the applause swelled around them. As the applause rippled through the cabin, Mel leaned back in his seat, his gaze drifting to the window. The glow of the moonlight painted the clouds in soft silver hues, a tranquil contrast to the storm of emotions that had just unfolded. He didn't look for validation among the passengers. Their clapping wasn't what he'd been speaking for. Still, a faint smile played on his lips, one born not of triumph, but of quiet understanding. The man beside him shifted awkwardly, the weight of the moment settling heavily on his shoulders. He avoided eye contact, his earlier bravado now reduced to a faint tremor in his voice. "Look," he muttered, his words stumbling over themselves, I didn't mean to. I guess I just didn't understand where you were coming from." The apology was clumsy, half-formed, but Mel nodded without hesitation. "It's all right," he said softly, his tone carrying no trace of bitterness. "We're all trying to figure things out one way or another." The man fell silent, retreating into his thoughts, his posture no longer confrontational but reflective. Around them, the energy in the cabin had shifted. Passengers who had initially been spectators now seemed eager to connect. A middle-aged woman with kind eyes leaned over from across the aisle, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you," she said, her words trembling slightly. "What you said, it meant something. To me, at least." Mel nodded again, his smile deepening, though he didn't reply. A young man a few rows up turned in his seat, his expression a mix of admiration and curiosity. "That was powerful," he said almost hesitantly, as if unsure he had the right to speak. "I didn't expect to hear something like that on a flight." Mel offered him a quiet nod, his demeanor humble, almost shy. "Sometimes the moment finds you," he said, "whether you're ready for it or not." As the murmurs of admiration spread, Mel remained mostly silent, listening to the words of strangers who now seemed to see him not as an actor, a celebrity, or a public figure, but as a man who had fought through storms of his own. He let their words wash over him, taking each one in, but offering little in return beyond a simple thank you or a faint smile. Just as the cabin began to settle, and it seemed the moment was reaching a gentle conclusion, Mel shifted his gaze back to the passenger beside him. His eyes held a depth that was impossible to ignore, a quiet intensity that silenced even the faintest whispers. "You asked me earlier what makes my faith matter," he said, his voice calm, almost contemplative. The man looked up, his expression guarded but attentive. Mel's lips curved into a faint smile, but his words carried an edge of mystery that seemed to hang in the air, refusing to settle. "Maybe it's not about what faith does for me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe it's about what it calls me to do for others." The cabin fell utterly silent again, passengers holding their breath as if the words needed room to echo. Mel turned his gaze back to the window, the faint glimmer of stars reflecting in his eyes. The plane soared onward, cutting through the endless dark, and the screen faded to black, leaving only questions and a quiet hope in its wake. Please don't forget to watch more heartwarming stories on your screen. Hit the subscribe button so you don't miss out on our latest stories.